Welcome to the Steady On Stronger Together podcast. I am your host, Angie Bauman. As much as I try not to, I can be sucked into comparison and feeling like I'm not measuring up in the world. It seems like everyone is doing or saying something that other people are listening to, and being able to offer what others affirm feels like something I can't achieve or hang on to. So I love how Susan Hoekstra in this conversation reminded me that while affirmation from other people feels good, it's really God's affirmation my heart hungers for. And God affirms me not because of Facebook followers or podcast downloads, though I am grateful you're listening today. God affirms me because I am His, and I feel His pleasure towards me as I make sacrifices to be obedient to His call on my life. This Notice Me world is not easy to navigate, but I think you'll hear as I talk with Susan that it gets a lot easier as we look for love in the right place. Let's listen in. Hello, Steady On community, and welcome to this Stronger Together conversation. I'm Angie Bauman, and my guest today is Susan Hoekstra, who has a new book called A Firm Grasp, Feeling Validated in a Notice Me World. And Susan is a writer and a podcaster. And this new book is launching into the world on June 26th. And Susan, we are delighted to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Angie. I can't wait to talk about this.
Susan and I know each other through Flourish Writers, right? That's how we got connected.
Right.
Isn't that true? Yes. I have developed so many wonderful ministry friendships through Flourish Writers. And so I always like to give a shout out to Flourish because I just think not only do they provide such awesome encouragement for those of us who have a message and are trying to craft it, but they also provide such a great place for community. So I've just been delighted to meet you and others as I've participated in that group. But I want to dive into your book. I want to learn a little bit more about what the heart of this message is. So will you tell us a little bit about what you see as the difference between validation and affirmation? And you talk about how you believe that a lot of us have this validation deficit. Will you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, we all want to be noticed, okay? Wanting attention isn't new. I think back to Lucifer, who took it way too far. He wanted to be worshiped, right? We're not necessarily talking about those extremes, although they do exist, but we love receiving awards or like getting a pat on the back. So let's think back to when you were born. The minute your parents looked at you, they got excited because the littlest accomplishments, you cooed or you smiled and you got all excited. But as we got older, that excitement kind of diminishes until we have major accomplishments like maybe graduation or a wedding. But deep down, the need still exists. So the challenge to admitting that need is that, guess what? It makes us dependent on others, which means we actually need someone to acknowledge our experiences. So we really need an eyewitness to our life, right? So in the book, I define validation as acknowledgement of someone's essence, their perspective, their experiences. So acknowledgement is just that, acknowledging. And it's crucial because God's establishment of free will supports validation as a fundamental human right. We all have a right to our space, our divine space, our perspective, right? And the opportunity to express it. It's really basically a human need. But affirmation, I want to say, is a little bit different because affirmation is actually approval of someone's essence, perspective, or experience. So when we approve of somebody, we're actually agreeing with them, aren't we? So as a child, of course, we need both. We need someone to acknowledge our right to our divine space, and that helps us get past our self-consciousness. Affirmation gives us the confidence to try new things. And honestly, even to this day, some of us are still looking for our parents' approval. But what's really challenging is our culture is that we don't seem to be satisfied now with simply being acknowledged. We want more. We want approval. And I almost think approval means agreement. You have to agree with me in what choices I've made. And so instead of love being a choice, it's almost like we say, love requires agreement. So let me give you an example. Let's She's not a believer, okay, but she decides she wants to live with her boyfriend. As your mom, you can say, acknowledge she has a right to make that decision, right? She can make that decision. However, you might, as a mom, not agree that it's a wise decision. So you don't necessarily approve. What causes conflict is that each person is viewing things from their own facet or their perspective. The mom is disappointed in the decision, and the daughter may conclude that you don't love her if you don't agree. So I would argue that that's not the case. We can love someone and not agree with them. And as we look at our example of Jesus, he didn't agree with everyone he loved. So let's talk a little bit maybe about how we get this need met. The first place we receive validation is from our primary community, and that's our family. In the book, I refer this as your fan club. They are the ones that get excited when we take our first step, put our picture on the refrigerator, and celebrate us when we go potty in the big potty. They not only validate but affirm. But if you didn't receive that acknowledgement as a child, what if your concerns were easily dismissed? One thing I remember saying to my mom when I was little, I put up my finger and I kind of moved it around and I say, "Mom, it hurts when I do that." And she responded, "Well, don't do that," right? I'll be honest with you, I didn't feel acknowledged in that moment. Okay. And so that creates a little bit of a deficit. And then when we're rejected for some reason or another, we need approval because we have to crave the opposite of it to compensate for that rejection. So we need that affirmation to counterbalance our negative feelings. And of course, we have to be careful because our need to be noticed can be lustful. Mm. We can turn it into, just like eating can become gluttony, sex can turn into adultery. The lust for attention is called approbation lust. And so there is a lust pattern there. So we have to be careful. So I think it's a really good conversation to have.
So I want to go back to a couple of things that you've said. You talked about early on how when we're looking for this, that we're actually depending on others to approve of us, validate us, affirm us, all of these things, right? And so what are some ways in the times that we live in right now that you see that we are trying to get it from other people?
Well, social media. I mean, come on, let's face it. Don't we kind of look at how many people like a post? Don't we get excited when somebody writes really good comments, or we get really upset if they don't? Mm-hmm. So it's a very much a notice me world, especially with social media. We've always had this need, but I think it's perpetuated now because of social media and the comparisons that come on social media.
Yeah. And I think this too, if let's say we put two things on social media on different days or whatever. And so there's this understanding, right? The one that got the most feedback, the most engagement, if you will, the most comments, the most likes was the better post, right? Don't we automatically do that, right? So this one was good and this one wasn't good, when actually there's so many other reasons why something might have gotten more attention than something else, right? But immediately we go to, well, the content or the heart of that message or whatever that post, depending on what you're doing. Yeah.
Something I did isn't good enough.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
That sense of unworthiness.
And so then where, this is an obvious answer, of course, but where do we need to be getting this affirmation? Let's talk about that for just a second.
Well, the affirmation that comes from God is truly satisfying. Mm-hmm. Okay, now that sounds like a nice blanket Christian statement.
It does, right? But we're going to unpack it just a little bit. Yeah.
But let's talk about this a little bit, because part of what the book is trying to do is just make us more self-aware of this need. Okay. When we're more aware of it, and maybe we've gone to get the need met in a way that doesn't satisfy, or that in a way it isn't truly satisfying, like that comes from God. So let's look at this I'm going to come at it from a left field a little bit. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we all have this feeling we're not good enough. At some point or another, we wrestle with that, right? we're not good enough in some way, shape, or form, or we've missed the mark. Now, in the book, I talk a little bit about three ways we, quote, miss the mark. One is we have limits. Okay, now these limits are things like I'm not going to be a supermodel, or I'm not a Olympic athlete, or something like that. We all have to understand that we have limits. There's only so far our physical talents or our abilities can take us. So we all have to acknowledge that we have limits. And that's just an acceptance. We just have to come to peace with that. Then mistakes. Mistakes I call are like spilling the milk, okay? Or adding up something wrong, or forgetting to take the library book back to the library. I mean, those are mistakes we make, right? Those mistakes they don't, we make them about us feeling unworthy, but the reality is we're human and we make mistakes, right? And then the third thing we do is we sin, okay? And sin is obviously disobeying God because we know better, or disobeying God because we don't know better, okay? So those are the three areas. Why can't we admit that we have those three things? Why is it such a struggle that we want to avoid talking about those things? We are unworthy. And we have to get comfortable saying it. We're unworthy because we sin. The other elements being limits and mistakes, just human nature. Just human nature. That's part of being human. But the sin is because that really defines our unworthiness. When we become saved, when we actually save, we are acknowledging, get that word, folks out there, acknowledging that we're sinners. We're sinning, and we're acknowledging to God that we're sinners, that we are unworthy. So what does God do at salvation? Well, we get God's approval now. We get the affirmation to counteract the unworthiness. So in reality, mercy tells us we won't be punished. We don't have to punish ourselves. Mercy tells us that how you feel about yourself is not an issue between God and us any longer. Each drop of blood that was shed, each nail that was nailed tells us something pretty affirming. We're worth it because the cross says we're worth it. So what that does is that balances it out. And we can live in the dichotomy of both of those.
I think there's this understanding as I've matured as a Christian to be able to recognize when I am seeking other people's approval. What does that feel like inside me? Right. Because I believe what you're saying, that I am validated to a place that will satisfy me only by God. Like this, I've been doing this long enough that I know that is true. No one else can fill this in me. I always say that trying to seek other people's approval is like, pouring water into a swimming pool with holes in the bottom. Like you can pour as much water, it can be like, flowing in there over and over and over and over and over. And it's not going to hold it though, right? It's just not going to hold it. But the affirmation of God takes root, and it goes deep, and it can be something that grows and sustains and develops. And but I think it's so key. It has been in me, and I think it is for all of us, to be able to recognize when we have again, because we will, turned our attention to receiving affirmation or validation from other people rather than from God alone, and being able to have a plan, if you will, of correction on that, because we've done it again, right? For me anyway, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. It's not a one and done.
It's not a one and done. And I think we're all a work in progress, right? Mm-hmm. But I think what happens is you might become more aware of your motivations, of when you're seeking affirmation, when it's appropriate, when it's not. One of my favorite verses is Psalm 37:6. And it says, He'll validate your life in the clear of day and stamp you with his approval at high noon. One of the chapters in the book is called Embrace. And this is a very vulnerable chapter. And I write about how God instructed me to stand in front of a mirror and look at myself for 15 minutes. Now, okay, I don't know where this came from, but I was going through a divorce. It was a tough time. I was feeling extremely rejected. Okay. And like I said, rejection, you need more affirmation, right? And God said, I want you to look at yourself in the mirror. I stood in front of that mirror for 15 minutes and I heard things from God, and he affirmed me in a way I can't really describe. I try to describe it in the chapter, but it's basically, he said, look at your arms. They're the ones that comforted your daughter when she was sick. Look at your eyes. Those spoke love into somebody else's life. I mean, there was just so many affirmations that he gave me at that time. It was a very, very beautiful time. And I think that we need to consider and take notice of when God is actually affirming us, because he does use other people to do it. But sometimes he's just doing it in the quietness of being in his presence.
Yeah, it's almost like for me, when I receive a compliment or an affirmation, I I know that that is like bonus material almost, if you will. Like it first comes from God, and then I'm able to receive that without needing it, if that makes sense. Like I
Right.
can appreciate it. And I'm just so blown away by someone who would take the time to send me an email and thank me for something that I offered or something like that, where I'm just like, isn't that just the greatest thing? But it doesn't cause me. But if I'm going into my email box looking for that, that's a whole different
Yeah.
place.
And so I would argue that you actually do need it.
Mm-hmm.
You do need it. It's just to what degree. And
Mm.
one of the things I have in the book too is a link to a validation quiz where you kind of just answer some questions, and it kind of just tells you if you have a healthy need for validation, or you ignore your need for validation, or you have an unhealthy or excessive need for validation. So there's some tips with that can help with that. And I think we do need to admit that we have the need, though, Angie, without, just like we have the need to eat, or we have the need for sex, or any of those other things. We have those needs. They're not evil in and of themselves. They're not sinful in and of themselves. They can get sinful if that's all we're seeking. See, in Christian worlds, we think we're all about self-promotion. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I have a podcast called The Notice, where I'm just trying to encourage people to notice what God's doing, right? And this book, I have to market a book. I have to say, hey, people, notice my book, which is kind of contrary to what I'm talking about in the book, because God will bring it to the people that need it. So I don't know, we struggle with that sometimes. I think we need to understand that it's a need. It's okay.
I think it reminds me of money. What is the teaching in the scriptures about money? It is not that money is bad, but it is the love of money that will
Right.
cause destruction, right? And I think this is the same way so much. It's not wanting someone in our lives to say, I see you, I appreciate you, I validate you, I believe in you, I support you. All of those things are so meaningful. They can be in our lives. But when we have a craving for it that is insatiable, and we all do to a certain degree, but when that's what we're like leaning into, or that's what we're trying to satisfy, then we've moved to a place of desiring it more from other people than we have created space to receive it from God.
This came really vibrant for me in my life because I'm a professional clarinetist. And after a performance, you give a performance, there's always, after performance, somebody comes up and what? Affirms you. Oh, that was beautiful. I loved it. I loved your solo. And for a while, I kept, like, after I do a performance, I mean, I'm embarrassed to admit it now, but I kind of waited. I wanted to see what people were going to say. Did they like it? Did they not like it? Did they hear it? Did they even hear my solo in the orchestra? So it was interesting because at first I did get some, and I do get those things, but it made me realize after a while that people are listening to the whole of everything. They're not just listening to you and your part because you're so engrossed in it. And God really showed me that I was seeking something that wasn't going to satisfy. And a lot of people out there who are doing creative things, and they want to be seen, and they want their creations to be seen, and they struggle with this. So the other people that struggle with validation are the fatherless, or people who didn't get affirmation from their father. They call it the father wound. I'm sure people have written books about that, plenty of books, but there is that sense that we didn't get that affirmation from our father. But one of the things that was really hard for me was being I grew up in a low socioeconomic, very violent neighborhood, and things happened, and I didn't feel safe. and so that made you kind of feel like no one's paying attention, no one's acknowledging. I had a knife pulled on me at a park, came home to my mom, and my mom I said, Mom, this guy pulled a knife out at me. And she goes, oh, those boys. And I'm going to tell you, I didn't feel acknowledged in that moment,
Right.
So, I mean, we all have those kinds of things that are wounds that really we struggle with. And I think especially abused people feel the biggest reason that most people who are abused feel unheard or unseen is because what happens is done in secret, and we're like demanded to hide it.
Mm-hmm.
So some pretty interesting ways. That's why sometimes we need things to balance out other things and wounds that have happened in our life.
What do you think is the reason? Because I believe there's such power in our stories. And I believe sharing stories like the ones that you've just mentioned, even from your life. I think about you standing in front of the mirror and being obedient to a God that was inviting you to be uncomfortable in your own presence for a little while. That's what I hear you saying in that,
Mm-hmm.
that I don't want it just to be me. I don't want to look at me. I don't want to look at my hurt. And God was inviting you into that space to allow you to feel his covering of that and his
Mm-hmm.
approval of that. The story that you just shared about the knife, I think others can relate to that when they have tried to express concern or fear or something, and the person that, like with your finger that you were saying, that you were met with, instead of that's not a very big deal. And so it doesn't validate your concern. It doesn't validate
Mm-hmm.
why do you think when we share those kinds of stories that they're helpful?
We are a piece of the master. When we talk about masterpiece, we're a piece of the master, right? And as a piece of the master, we reflect a certain facet or part of God. We don't reflect all of God. We reflect a part of him, right? And we do that in 5 different ways. One is just our presence, because we have the Holy Spirit in us. We can just be present in a room, and we can be sharing our story, so to speak. The connection and the fruits of the Spirit, when we display the fruits of the Spirit, those are ways. Our gifts, talents and spiritual gifts, our sphere of influence, who God brings into our world, who we talk to, whether it's the person at McDonald's or on a stage or platform, and then storytelling. And so storytelling is huge. First of all, God says, go and tell. Okay. All right. So this is important. And I really think it's important because then we're acknowledging. What are we acknowledging? We're acknowledging the hurt in our life. We're acknowledging what God did. Okay. And our stories and our experiences, they can bring comfort and encouragement to others. This is validation at its finest. We're acknowledging what God has done, because no one else can reflect our piece of the master. So when we tell our stories, we're able to resonate and really acknowledge God. Because when we stop worrying about getting acknowledgement for ourselves, we start realizing that we're really here to acknowledge God.
One of the things that we talk about in this community so much, well, these are the things we talk about: the lives we believe, the places we are stuck, and the biblical application that can help us move forward. So I'm just going to ask you around this, and I think you've mentioned it already in a maybe a different way, but just like kind of straight on. What is the lie that we believe when we're going in search of affirmation or validation in an unhealthy, to an unhealthy degree?
That's going to satisfy. That somehow somebody telling us we're wonderful or they appreciate us or whatever, that somehow that's going to satisfy.
Mm-hmm.
That's the lie we believe.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think it's trying to cover? What is it that's unsatisfied that will satisfy?
Well, I think it has to go back to the deficit. When you have a deficit, you've got to come to terms. There's a chapter in the book called The Frame, where we talk about your past and getting comfortable with the wounds of your past, because then when you know what those wounds are, then you can realize, how am I trying to compensate for that wound in some way? Why am I trying to seek out this to satisfy this? It's sort of like being thirsty and you eat a banana. there's some, I don't know if there's even water in a banana, but you get something is satisfied, but not totally, because you're really thirsty.
Yeah, I like that analogy very much. Yeah, because we do like with both hands, we're trying to grasp and hang on to something that actually is just slipping through our fingers as fast as we pick it up. The kind of witness that we could be for Christ if we did not depend on the approval of other people, right? Depend on, not that it's not appreciated when we get it, but if we honestly believed in the Holy Spirit power within us and in our calling, in our mission, whatever that happens to be in our life, whatever season we're in, because I don't think there's just one for all of us, but whatever God is calling us to do, if we could step out and do that thing, be that person, because He has said we are worthy of that call and not seek approval along the way, what a different kind of witness each of us would be.
Absolutely. True confidence that comes when we can stand up in front of people, when we can live out our calling, is because we have confidence that we're obeying God.
Yeah.
Obedience equals confidence. If we just rely on doing things, we have confidence if we're doing it God's way, don't we?
Yes.
So
yes.
that's a big part. Just obeying is really, it's part of being a firm grasp, just getting a grasp on obedience.
That's good. That's good. Hey, before I let you go, I always like to close on this question. What are you reading, listening to, studying, anything goes that is just encouraging you and keeping you connected to God right now?
Well, I don't know about anybody else out there, but I'm kind of a fan of The Chosen.
You know what? Several people on this have mentioned that to me.
Yeah.
I have not watched any of it, but
gotta watch it,
that's what
Angie.
everybody says. They love it. The Chosen. Yeah.
The Chosen is great. Of course, reading scripture. I'm also reading a book called How to Stop the Pain, which talks about judgment. Very good book about the difference between judgment and observation. Very, very helpful. And of course, I love listening to music because I'm a musician. And my favorite album right now is Natalie Grant's new album, No Stranger. And, my favorite is, your presence is my weapon. And that really resonates a lot with me, because with music, I can really connect. It gives me a connection with God, along with praying throughout the day and my own songwriting and writing myself. So
I think we're all creative in some way. A lot of people they say, I'm not creative or something, but I think as we connect more with God's affirmation and validation and have a deeper understanding of His incredible love for us and His mercy for us. And I always kind of make the argument, if you will, that the more that we understand that and are filled up with it, the more it can overflow onto other people. And some of that overflow, I think, is creative ways. And that doesn't mean we're all musicians or that we're all writers or dancers or something, but there's something we do in that understanding that creates something in the world that wasn't there before. And I think it's a spiritual offering. I really do. I think it can be anyway.
Creating is creating something that wasn't there before. This could be a pillow. It could be sewing. Right. It could be, redoing your house or whatever, creating something that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
So definitely.
Susan, I'm so excited for you and this book, and I'm so appreciative of you lending a little bit of time with us today. Thank you so much for doing that. Susan's book is A Firm Grasp, Feeling Validated in a Notice Me World. And her podcast is called The Notice. And I will link all of those things and her website in the show notes today. And we're so grateful for your time and all the best as you launch this book into the world.
Okay, Angie, I'm just going to affirm you before you go. Thank you for doing this podcast. Thanks for getting the message out. And thanks for staying mission focused.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I appreciate that. We will sign off. Yes. Until next time.
All right.
Peace.
Thanks.
We all want to be seen, known, and loved. I hope you have felt the affirmation from others close to you all your life. But if you have not, hear this. There's no lack of affirmation in this world that can ever diminish the affirmation for you that your Heavenly Father puts on display. If you haven't already, I hope you'll subscribe to the Steady On podcast today. When you're subscribed, you'll automatically see the new episodes plus any bonus material. Also, I have a new freebie available on my website. If you would like a guided devotional resource, I encourage you to find the link in today's show notes so it can be delivered directly to your email inbox. Thank you so much for listening. I pray wherever your day takes you, you are walking in the confident knowledge that you are a beloved, cherished child of God. Peace.